This is Intercepted.
Welcome to Dropsite News. I'm Murtaza Hussain. Although the conflict may not yet be over, the Israeli war in the Gaza Strip has already become a turning point in modern history. The US-backed assault on the territory has continued for well over a year in the face of international outcry, as well as credible accusations of genocide leveled against Israeli leaders by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Official statistics record tens of thousands of dead in Gaza, but some estimates from international medical observers suggest that the real toll may wind up being in the hundreds of thousands. After the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust, the US and other Western nations attempted, in theory, to develop a system of liberal norms that would prevent such carnage targeting civilian populations from being carried out again. With the population of Gaza now subjected to indiscriminate bombing on a scale dwarfing that of other modern conflicts, and international law deemed irrelevant by its former proponents, it appears that this dream of liberal order has now been abandoned, with an uncertain future now awaiting us. To discuss the meaning of the war on Gaza, we are now joined by author Pankaj Mishra. His latest book, The World After Gaza, A History, is out now. Pankaj, welcome to Dropsite.
Thank you, Murtaza.
So I should mention to our listeners that Pankaj has been a huge influence on me over the years. Intellectually, I've read, all his books and essays and so forth, and whatever intellectual views I've developed, or, my worldview, we could say, is very much shaped by Pankaj's influence. So we're very lucky to have him on the show today. Pankaj, you have written many books of history, you've written novels, you've written travelogues. Your most recent book is actually a reflection, maybe even called an intellectual history of the current war on Gaza. Can you talk a bit about what prompted you to write this book and what kind of message you're trying to convey by reflecting on this event, which is still ongoing at the moment?
Well, I think, in the first instance, I was motivated by, I don't know whether you can be motivated by despair or a sense of hopelessness, a great anguish, but I was certainly driven by these feelings and these emotions. Soon after October 7, we saw this extraordinary Israeli onslaught on Gaza. And also, not only that, we also saw politicians and journalists across Western Europe and the United States come to both justify and condone this extraordinary violence and destruction in Gaza. And I think my first response to this extraordinary, intolerable situation was to write an essay that was published earlier last year. And then, of course, during the course of thinking about that essay, I had so much material, so many more things to say. I felt that I should write a book. And again, I think really writing the book was a way of also coping with horrific, monstrous events. We've all, lived through the last 15 months with these sort of images of extreme atrocity. We've seen things that we never imagined we would see in our lifetimes, things that human beings have never probably seen before. So I think in many ways writing this book was a way of coping with this onslaught of atrocity on our minds and souls. So in that sense, this book is extremely unlike anything I've written before. Anything that I've written, and anything that I've it's also different in its motivations from everything else that I've written.
Yeah, one thing that you do in the book is you chart out I should say it this way, you actually contextualize the war in Gaza with the entire post-World War II liberal view of how things should be ordered, the lessons that people should have taken from the Holocaust and from the catastrophes of the 20th century. And it's very jarring because you kind of show how In many ways, those lessons, which we took to be very solid, have been proven to be very contingent, and we're actually reverting back to the world that existed before. Ostensibly, it changed in 1945 when the World War II ended. Can you talk a bit about how the Holocaust and the post-World War order relates to what's happening in Gaza at the moment, when it seems like all the norms and rules that the international community ostensibly had claimed to have created to forestall such events in the future seem to have been left by the wayside?
Murtaza, I think, we know that civilization is an extremely fragile construct, that it's only certain norms, certain laws, certain rules that hold it together. And there is very little ultimately that separates us from a state of barbarism. And I think Europe in particular knew this extremely intimately during the first half of the 20th century, when it fought two civil wars with enormous civilian toll. Millions and millions of people died in these two world wars, and then, of course, you had the Holocaust, the very deliberate killing of 6 million Jews. And you think that enough lessons would be drawn from this unprecedented episode in human history, and that people would finally know how to avoid ideologies, belief systems, value systems that push you into such unprecedented bloodletting. And of course, I think in retrospect, it seems the early decades after 1945 was actually a time of reckoning with these disasters. It was also a time of reconstruction. But it also appears that it was also a time of delusion. And I think it's now becoming clearer that the lessons of the Holocaust were not learned, or at least the lessons that were learned were the wrong lessons or were partial lessons. We didn't really figure out again how to create societies based on values and principles that we can all uphold proudly. There are just so many things that were not really learned, and I think today we've gone back to a sort of extremely 19th century social Darwinist mode of thinking, where might is right, and rules and laws are really made by the strong for the benefit of the strong, and the weak can suffer. It's their lot. It's their fate to suffer because they're weak. I think all this really obliges us to ask very urgent and strong questions about our societies, our place in the world, and I feel like that sort of process had only just begun. I feel that I've been asking those questions for some time now, and so this book, even though it's prompted by the atrocity of Gaza, in many ways it's a sort of continuation of a certain line of thinking, a line of questioning that started several years ago.
Pankaj, one thing that's very notable in terms of global responses to this conflict since it first emerged about 7 decades ago is the divide between, roughly you could say, global South and global North countries in their views of this conflict and their sympathies. Obviously there are exceptions and it doesn't line up perfectly, but it seems that, historically, countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia have tended to identify themselves more with the position of the Palestinians, while countries in Europe, United States, North America, in the West, quote unquote, tend to see themselves identify more with the Israelis. And we see actually this divide even manifesting within societies, whereas you see in the United States, people from minority groups or immigrant backgrounds tend to be more sympathetic to Palestinians, while people from the majority sometimes see themselves more in the Israelis' position. Can you talk a bit about why people's views of this conflict seems to be so different based on their positionality?
I don't think it would seem like such a puzzle if you agree that decolonization was the biggest event of the 20th century. If you see that liberation from a global racial hierarchy in which white people were on top and everyone else was dominated by them, that was something that many Asians and Africans fought against, and eventually they secured sovereign nation states of their own. They achieved a degree of independence and autonomy from the former European masters. I think in that context, in the context of this world historical event, which is decolonization, the continued Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and not just occupation, but sort of expansion of Israeli territory into West Bank, and now it seems into Gaza, that would only seem to many people in Asia and Africa, and indeed among minority populations, immigrant populations, as an abomination, as an anachronistic event and process. Because if you grow up with that particular historical experience, belonging to nation states that fought extremely hard for their independence, for a modicum of freedom and dignity, then you can very quickly, easily see that what is happening in Palestine is wrong, and that should not be allowed to continue, because this mode of racial domination, this mode of domination per se, is wrong. I think you'll have trouble understanding this if you are coming from if you have a historical perspective largely shaped by the experience of Western countries. Then you would argue that, the Holocaust obviously made Israel, a moral necessity, and an extension of that, Israel is justified to do whatever it needs to do in order to protect itself. That's an experience. That's a perspective of mostly people and older people in Western Europe and the United States. So that is why I think the conflict provokes such polarized reactions, because people are responding to it from a particular place in the world, out of a particular experience of the world.
Pankaj, one thing I often reflect regarding the creation of Israel, is that it seems like Israel was a country that was created late. And what I mean by that is that the process of its creation in many ways seems to have hallmarks of the way the United States or the British Commonwealth countries were created in the New World, countries were created in Latin America. There was a very frank acknowledgement that expelling the native population or the pre-existing population was a prerequisite to establishing a country, which ostensibly would be better than that which existed before. And when you look at the statements of early Israeli leaders, they very, very openly described it as a colonization enterprise. And they did not have a negative valence to that term. They sort of viewed it matter-of-factly, and in fact depicted it that way to win more Western support for the endeavor at that time. But it seems that, after obviously the Holocaust took place and World War II happened, there was this very jarring moment in Europe and much of the rest of the world saying that, well, we need a clean break from our previous suite of values because they've led us to this sort of destruction. But now, when you talk to people about this subject, Israel is sort of depicted as, just another one of, almost like a European Union country and no different than any other. And it needs to defend itself in the same manner that the US or Belgium would defend themselves if they were under attack. Can you talk a bit about why Israel is unique in the sense that why it is actually not similar to any other country presently existing in Europe, and why its sort of hallmarks as a late colonial power are relevant to its current conflict with the Palestinians?
That's very interesting, Murtaza. I think, another way to look at it is to look at it from let's say, the Asian or African perspective. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that the Zionist project received a lot of support from people in Asia and Africa who were fighting for their own independent nation state, and they were often fighting against European powers in this connection, and they felt a kind of natural sympathy for Zionists. They were not, probably aware that some of these Zionists were talking about colonization, but they knew that Jews were being very badly treated in Europe and in Russia. And as sort of, people, there was a lot of fellow feeling, let's put it this way, for persecuted Jews, like, they're also entitled to a homeland of their own where they can live lives with freedom and dignity. So whether it's Sun Yat-sen or of China, the sort of great nationalist icon, or Gandhi or Nehru, there are so many people you can think of. There was a lot of sympathy for the Zionist project. Now, what happens? What you call the sort of delayed birth of Israel? It is a delayed birth in the late 40s, and before that, of course. Israel comes to be identified more and more from the 1920s onwards as something that Western powers seek to impose upon the Middle East. And this is why people like Gandhi and Nehru start to nuance their support for Zionism. Gandhi saying, look, I think the Jews have every right to return to their homeland, but not with the help of British imperialists. So they start to qualify this. And I think what actually then happens is that Israel is perceived increasingly by people, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, around the global South, as a country that is essentially being created with the help of British, European, American imperialists. And then, of course, as a nation state, Israel becomes this expansionist country, a very close ally of the United States from the 1960s onwards. So this image of Israel, which is essentially a white European country, even though most of the population of Israel consists of Jews from Arab countries. But the image really is because of these alliances with the West, with Western powers, with Western imperialist powers, that Israel is, as Primo Levi put it, I quote him in my book, is a sort of pawn of imperialism. That's a sort of image, and that image has somehow survived, despite sort of demographic shifts and changes, and the rise of sort of within Israel of people who were once treated very badly because they came from Arab countries. And I think it very much depends on, you're looking at this, it very much depends on where you're looking from when you look at Israel. Where are you placed in the wider world? And at what time? So something like Zionism, which is broadly acceptable to the anti-colonial leaders of Asia and Africa, steadily becomes something that they dislike to the extent, of passing a resolution at the United Nations in 1975, which equates racism with racial discrimination.
One thing that strikes me is that for the last half century or longer than that, the Holocaust has not just been a historical event, but it's been kind of the foundational moral story of the post-World War II West and maybe even the world more broadly. And a lot of the components of that story are about suspicion of, very bellicose, militaristic nationalism, social Darwinism, and also the idea that people who are weak or people who don't have military power still enjoy rights, and those rights are inalienable and must be protected. And it seems that the modern incarnation of Israel is actually a repudiation of that moral story, which, even though that story sort of also at the same time provides a lot of the impetus for supporting Israel as a country for victims of the Holocaust. It's interesting because it seems like it's hard to maintain both of those two narratives at the same time, and one of them is inevitably going to win out, and maybe seems like the one which is repudiating the Holocaust story. Can you talk a bit about, what the Holocaust really means for the post-World War II world and how it sort of informed our moral values and how you see that maybe in flux at the moment?
Well, I think, the first narrative that you offered, where the lessons of the Holocaust are thought to be incarnated, to be institutionalized, to be embodied in international institutions, human rights regimes, regulations, in declarations of various sorts. And that, it's a very straightforward sort of lesson, which is that, we cannot allow nation states to trample over the rights of individuals. We have to be very alert to certain modes of rhetoric, certain modes of dehumanization, because we know now that they lead directly to mass extermination. Now, I would argue that this particular lesson, although it was embodied in various organizations and sort of ritualized in ceremonies of various sorts and in remembrance rituals of various sorts, was not nearly as powerful as the narrative that the State of Israel started to create and consolidate from the 1960s onwards, which is that the Holocaust was a monstrous crime motivated by anti-Semitism, and that this is now something that is no longer in the it's not really in the past. This is an ever-present danger. Genocidal anti-Semitism is an ever-present danger, and we have to constantly be on guard. Indeed, our neighbors could be potential Nazis. In fact, many of them were described as Nazis. But it's not just the leaders of Hamas today. Yasser Arafat was described as a Nazi. Egypt's president Nasser was described as a Nazi. So that's another sort of lesson, that the Nazis are constantly waiting, the new Nazis, to destroy the state of Israel and exterminate the Jewish population. That is the narrative that has taken hold, and that has become politically far more influential than the other narrative that you describe, which is, taking from the Holocaust a broader lesson about political systems, social sort of systems, and economic systems that sort of foster, encourage this kind of murderous prejudice, and which can be unleashed against any minority, not just the Jewish population. So I think the State of Israel took a very particular sort of interpretation of the Holocaust and turned it into a kind of self-legitimizing national narrative, which is something you see now. Something like October 7 happens, and there is this constant invocation of the Holocaust, of genocide. Many people have said that what happened on October 7 was a genocide. It's not what the Israelis have done in Gaza, but what happened on October 7. So there is this attempt to constantly invoke that particular memory and to again send out a message, even though Israel is the most powerful state in the Middle East, it's actually a nuclear power, but they still want to send out the message that we are at any moment likely to be exterminated. So it's a paranoid state of mind that over the decades, this particular memory and construction of the Holocaust has constructed and encouraged.
I'm curious, from your perspective, how the events of the past year and a half have changed people's views outside the West. Obviously, in the West, it's been very polarizing. You've seen, internal communities in some countries who are very vociferous in support of the Palestinians, and then, state establishments which are more sympathetic to Israel. And then obviously there's some countries like Spain, Ireland, which are very, very notably pro-Palestinian. But I'm curious how Asian and African countries have responded to this crisis. And, we've seen some countries like South Africa be very voluble in taking Israel to court. But how are public perceptions evolving? Because, in the last century, obviously there was this very strong push a shared experience of decolonization, which countries identified with. But now it seems like not all the countries in the quote-unquote global south are necessarily in the same stage of history or at the same level of experience. How are people, for instance, in India or other countries in Africa and Latin America, in your perception, viewing this, and what may inform different views they have of the subject?
I think, Murtaza, you'll find there are little sort of, pockets here and there in Asia and Africa, Latin America, where you find support for Israel. For instance, in India, I think the Indian government's support for Netanyahu, and even that is now being nuanced, projects a rather misleading impression of what the Indian population at large thinks about this issue. I mean, to be very honest, most of the Indian population doesn't seem to know much and doesn't seem to care much about what's happening outside of India. So I think we can safely discount, what they think about this issue. But I think for a lot of educated Indians, the constant exposure to atrocities committed by the IDF in Gaza, even I know personally some of the most sort of hardened pro-Israel, and I grew up in a pro-Israel family. I know lots of people who are still even more, in fact, staunchly pro-Israel. But even they have been asking questions like, how can they kill so many children? Very innocent, very naive questions like these. So I think it would be a mistake to assess public postures or public opinion by looking only at government statements or government policies. India is one example. And look at Latin America. I can't think of any other country apart from Argentina where you have a madman, a kind of sort of Trump Me Too running the country. And he is, of course, one of those maniacs like Bolsonaro who are very pro-Israel. But I don't know whether that actually also reflects the opinions of the vast majority of the Argentinian population. Anywhere else in South America, I can't think of any country which has significant public support for Israel. I think they're almost uniformly pro-Palestinian. If you cast your eyes at Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, absolutely no evidence of any kind of pro-Israel sentiment. China, always traditionally been pro-Palestinian. China was one of the countries that signed the resolution in 1975 denouncing Zionism as a form of racism. It has definitely moved away from that position, but I don't think anybody can say that the Chinese government is pro-Israel. Japan, a country traditionally allied to Western powers. You mentioned Spain and Ireland. I would also say put Japan in the category of countries that have been pretty vocal about, wanting a ceasefire very early in the conflict. There have been lots of demonstrations in Japan by ordinary people against the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. So, we don't know enough about Russia, of course, but Russia has traditionally been pro-Palestinian. I doubt very much is going to change that position, especially now there are some propaganda advantages to be had by standing with Asia, Africa, and Latin America and condemning Israeli atrocities. So it's really, I think, I don't think, you would find significant levels of support for the far-right regime in Israel outside the West.
I often try to think of this subject in the term of a long-term perspective, because obviously, the state of Israel was created 7 decades ago. This conflict has not abated by any means in any time since that 7 decades, and we look to be continuing to be trapped in it, doomed to continue it for some time to come, maybe generations to come, based on present events. But I try to think of how, what's the final stage to this solution? Oh, sorry, let me refer to this differently. What's the final outcome to this conflict that maybe is reasonable or realistic? Obviously, for many, many years, there was the idea of a two-state solution, and then it seemed to mimic the partitions that took place in ethnic conflicts in other parts of the world, that the Israelis will be given one state and the Palestinians will be given another, and then they can govern themselves and deal with each other through interstate relations. That solution seems to now have become very distant or very improbable because of the continued settlement project in the West Bank, and now potentially the removal of the Palestinian population from Gaza. And yet, either regardless what happens, both peoples will still be here. They'll still be in the region. They'll still be in the world, and the conflict itself over the claims of the land will not dissipate. Although it's very hard to conceptualize at the moment, is there anything that you've thought of that you may see as an outcome of this conflict, which may finally allow people to transcend it or be mutually satisfactory to both sides? Or do you think that this is a zero-sum conflict, which can only be settled with one people losing entirely and the other remaining? What seems realistic to you at this point?
I think with the arrival of Trump in the White House, it's unfortunately the latter scenario which is more likely to be realized. I think Trump basically confirms the broad trend across not just, I would say, Western Europe or United States, but really around the world, which is this sort of very simple principle that might makes right. And I think if you combine that with, evangelist Christian fantasies of Armageddon, if you combine that with Trump's real estate ambitions, if you combine that with the sort of still lingering crazy neocon presence in American political cultures, I think we are actually looking at a situation where the prospects for a Palestinian state are systematically destroyed, and that we do, have essentially Israeli expansion into parts of Gaza, if not the entire territory, and in a way, you could argue that the Palestinian state has been almost continuously undermined, the idea of it, the prospects for him. And now we may be looking at the final destruction of that idea with Trump in charge. So as much as I would like to imagine, a different scenario and the sort of, encourage the hope that out of this bloodshed, out of this great suffering, something better, a world with less misery comes into existence. I don't know whether it would be, really rational or sensible to encourage such a hope right now.
Pankaj, I wanted to pivot a bit briefly to yourself, because obviously you have been very, very vocal about this subject. You had a column for many years at Bloomberg. You've written about this in essays, in articles. You've spoken about it at public events. And, you are somebody who very much has the ear of the liberal establishment, and your work has been celebrated and very, very popular and published. How have they responded to you taking this very, very strong stance in favor and sympathy of the Palestinian plight? I imagine it made them uncomfortable, but I'm just curious your own experience and what you've encountered taking this position.
I think we'll see how they respond to this book. I think, I would also qualify your account a little bit by saying that I've certainly felt myself embattled against this establishment, against what I saw as its delusions and its fantasies. And, whatever is happening today, especially, the sort of far-right surge, mainstreaming of ugly prejudice, of ugly racism, I feel like this is something that I've been writing about for a long time. And back then I was critiquing not politicians, but writers and journalists who were mainstreaming extremely dangerous ideas. And these were often, liberal, so-called liberal intellectuals. These were not sort of right-wing agitators. So I feel like, in many ways what is happening today is the culmination of a long process whereby all kinds of historical delusions or delusions about the past went into the making of political postures, political policies. To just give you one example, I think most people have forgotten when we condemn the role of the BBC today in sort of covering in its coverage of the genocide in Gaza, we forget this is the same organization that also aired a television series called Empire, which basically argued how the British Empire was wonderful for the world. So I think the regime of propaganda, the regime of mendacity and falsehood and delusion has been with us for much longer. And I was one of the few people critiquing it and writing about it. And I think, the recognition I got was not really from the liberal establishment. It was from my readers. It was from people like yourself who are not part of the liberal establishment. I felt myself on the margins. I felt myself isolated really in within that establishment. And today that establishment, it exists, but it is pretty, powerless at this point, and helpless against Trump's onslaught. It has no answers really because it has been complicit in far too much that has led us to this stage.
Pankaj, the book is called The World After Gaza. And obviously, it suggests that there was a moral, divide that will take place between the time period from October 7th and the war thereafter. How do you envision the world after Gaza looking different from what came before? I have my own thoughts about it in the sense that I have said before that I think we're seeing the formal disavowance of post-World War II liberal international norms, which were always very inadequately applied in the first place. What do you think the world after Gaza is going to look like?
I think, again, as you say, the liberal international order went to some efforts to conceal the fact that it's the strong who make the laws, and those laws are designed for their benefit, and they can break them anytime it suits them. We know that the liberal international order was a sham in that respect, but nevertheless, it was a necessary sham because I think, even while violating those rules, they were still, in some sense, seeking to uphold them. They were not discarding them altogether. Now, I think we are looking at a, sort of social Darwinist situation where, might really is right, and it's force, violent force, that will remake borders, that will remake countries, that will expel one population to some other part of the world. Whether it's Greenland, the designs on the Panama Canal, or setting up Gaza as the new Riviera. I think we are looking really at an extensive political, moral breakdown. And so that is really, in a way, the world after Gaza that has come to light, except that I would say I would insist that this is not a break from what has been happening all these decades. It's very much a culmination of a series of such events. And, I think, I could answer this question at greater length, but I think, many things have been in process for some time now. The most important of them being the fact of Western decline on the whole, the rise of various other countries that were once, geopolitically and economically significant. And I think this process has the loss of power, or at least relative power, has created a kind of derangement, across large parts of Western Europe and United States. And I just don't think that these kinds of things are reversible. They have their own historical logic and momentum. And I'm afraid all we can really do is try and record truthfully, where things take us.
I want to end on a note which is somewhat hopeful. In your book, you juxtapose the very, very bloodthirsty and disturbing attitudes of many of our existing elites to the attitudes of younger people. And obviously in the United States, the past year, there was this tremendous and I would say maybe unprecedented outpouring of sympathy and support for Palestinians from young college students, people, from different walks of life, who are not traditionally represented in the U.S. establishment. And we saw mass protests all over the country. And those protests have been met now with police repression, sometimes street violence. And we're seeing under the new Trump administration and even under the Biden administration as well, now legal attempts to basically stifle speech and intimidate people or even prohibit expressions of pro-Palestinian sentiment. But it seems like these are very difficult rearguard actions to wage against what seems to be a very popular response from the younger generation. You wrote in the book about these student protests that we saw on campuses. What do you see as the significance of those protests? And do you think it augurs something better for the future, potentially, vis-a-vis the Western and American stance on the subject?
I think, Murtaza, that's really been the only source of hope in the last few months. I think the determination of young people to protest publicly against the atrocities their elders are committing or justifying or condoning. I think it shows that for people who are not part of the establishment, who are not even part of any professional life, who have not gone into the professions yet, who are not worried about their social status, who are not worried about their careers, who are not worried about being ostracized by their peers for their opinions, it's for them, I think it's very clear what was happening. They have a very strong sense of what is right and wrong, like most individuals do before their moral sense is clouded by professional imperatives, by motivations such as career advancement. The students don't really have careers at this stage, and they have managed to articulate really what is so horribly wrong about not only what Israel has done in Gaza, but also the way very powerful, influential people in politics and the media and business have supported and justified these atrocities. So as a sort of, fount of moral outrage and compassionate concern for the weaker peoples, for the people who are really suffering the most in this conflict, I think young people have held out, a little sort of a modicum of hope, I would say, and sort of made things less bleak. Things are pretty bleak on the whole. But I think, when I think of the future and I think of these young people in positions of power and influence, after our generation has passed, I'm older than you, and I think my generation has been really, truly catastrophic in many ways. When these younger people come into positions of power and influence, I hope it's their memory of what they have seen and what they have known, what they have experienced, that would make them better people, that would make them a more compassionate people. That is my hope. It's a very modest hope, but, nevertheless, there it is.
Pankaj, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Murtaza. Yeah, thank you for asking these penetrating questions, making me think.
That was author Pankaj Mishra. His latest book, The World After Gaza, A History, is out now. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our new podcast feed by searching for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review. It helps other listeners to find us as well. Our show today was produced by Jose Oliveras. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsitenews.com. If you have the funds to do so, please become a paid subscriber. All of our content is free for anyone, but our paid subscribers are the fuel that keeps our engine running. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, and please do share our work. This program was made possible in part by a grant from The Intercept. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Murtaza Hussain.